September 2017 brought a harsh hurricane season to the Caribbean. The island of St. Thomas in the United States Virgin Islands had already been pummeled by Hurricane Irma when news arrived of a second hurricane approaching. With only a few days to get ready, the island's residents started to either evacuate or hunker down. Among those who decided to stay was 32-year-old Hannah Up. A teacher at the Montessori school, Hannah was known for her vibrant, energetic, fearless, and adventurous nature, but the strain from the hurricane appeared to be wearing her down. While she was preparing her classroom for the second storm, her co-workers noticed she was off. Her positive, bubbly demeanor was muted. She was described as acting complacent and quiet, which was very unusual for her, though at the time it was easy to brush that off as just stress from the storm. On September 14th, Hannah's roommates saw her get up and leave the house around 8 a.m. Though it was earlier than she usually left the house, her roommate assumed that she was going to work early to help out the school. This would end up being the last confirmed sighting of Hannah. The following day, Hannah missed a meeting at the school, and her coworker and best friend, Maggie Guzman, thought that this was highly unusual. She tried to call her, but no answer, and had stopped by Hannah's house and noticed her car wasn't in the driveway. Becoming increasingly concerned, Maggie started contacting Hannah's friends and family. One of Hannah's oldest friends cryptically told her to look by water. Maggie started a search party and asked people to start looking in Hannah's favorite spots. One beach in particular, Sapphire Beach, was Hannah's favorite place to swim. The beach was a disaster. Hurricane Irma had turned the pristine beach into a wrecking yard of debris. The beach was deserted, but there in the parking lot was Hannah's car. Inside the vehicle were her purse, passport, ID, and $100 in cash. On a bar stool in what used to be a beach hut bar was a pile of neatly folded clothing, sandals, and car keys, all belonging to Hannah. At that point, Hannah had already been missing for 2 days when the official search for her began. It was believed that she'd gone for a swim and something may have happened to her. Because ferries and local boaters were helping to evacuate the island, there was heavy boat traffic that day. The entire perimeter of the island was searched with no sign of Hannah anywhere. During the search, it was discovered that this wasn't the first time that Hannah had gone missing. This would be the third time, and the previous 2 incidents also had happened under similar circumstances. Back in September 2008, the then 23-year-old said goodbye to her roommate. It had been the first day of her new teaching job in New York City. Again, she failed to show up, for which immediately launched a missing person investigation. The NYPD had treated the case from the start as an abduction, as Hannah had disappeared without her wallet, ID, and left cash in her apartment. She vanished without a trace. 9 days into her disappearance, NYPD received a call from a man who'd gone to school with Hannah, and he said that he'd seen her at an Apple store. He said that he'd gone up to her and asked her if she was the Hannah that was missing, and bizarrely, she said that she wasn't Hannah, nor was she missing. This confused the man, as he was sure he was talking to Hannah and she was very much missing. The NYPD got surveillance footage from the store and they were able to confirm it was Hannah Up. Why had she told the man she wasn't Hannah? The NYPD determined that Hannah had been to the Apple store to log in to her Gmail account and confirm that she was alive. But it started more questions than answers. What was she doing? Why was she hiding? Why had she seemingly abandoned her life? 2 weeks into her disappearance, it was discovered that she had been using the facilities of her old gym to shower. Though she had no ID on her, she remembered her gym number, and a front desk person was able to confirm her identity. She'd also been sighted at a Starbucks in Soho, but she had disappeared again by the time officers had arrived. On 20th day, since she'd first gone missing, the ferry captain of Staten Island Ferry saw a woman's head bobbing in the water, floating face down. They deployed a rescue boat and assumed the young woman was dead, and were shocked when she gasped for air and started crying as they lifted her out of the water. She was taken to the hospital, severely dehydrated, hypothermic, and covered in sunburns, but otherwise okay. She wasn't able to tell medical staff who she was or what had happened to her. At the hospital, she was diagnosed with a rare form of amnesia called dissociative fugue. Usually only brought on by extreme psychological trauma, it is the same form of amnesia that was portrayed in the Jason Bourne story. Sufferers often appear very typical, though they may not be able to tell people who they are. They can continue on everyday activities that they may have done routinely in the past, like show up at your old gym or go to places that are most familiar to them. What had happened to Hannah that brought on the state? Eventually, Hannah could remember her first name and gave medical staff her mother's phone number. Her mother arrived less than an hour later, and the first thing Hannah said was, "Why am I wet?" She had no memory of the past 3 weeks, and the last thing she remembered was going for a run the day she went missing. She was embarrassed by the news coverage and had even considered changing her name to get away from the publicity. A year after the incident in New York, she left. She eventually landed in Maryland, where she became a teaching assistant at a Montessori school for underserved children. She loved the theology behind Montessori and enjoyed her work there. She went all in, 100% into her work. It was a September morning in 2011 when Hannah's mother got a call from the police. Hannah had once again been reported missing and, like before, her purse, cell phone, and wallet had all been located, but this time on a footpath on a walking trail. When a purse had been found, the last time anyone had seen her was the day before. Another search was undertaken, and it was close to midnight when her mother received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end only said, "Mom?" Hannah had again been in a fugue state, but she had come out of it by herself, and when she came to, she realized she was sitting in a creek with a shopping cart next to her. Once again, she had no idea how she got there or how much time had passed this time. She'd been able to navigate herself out of the woods and found some commercial buildings where she was able to borrow a stranger's phone. All 3 disappearances had happened in September, right before a new school year began. In the days following up to her 2017 disappearance, friends had noticed she had been acting odd. She had told one friend that she didn't like the fall. None of her friends in St. Thomas knew about her past disappearances. Her family had been nervous for her to move so far away, but Hannah had laughed and said, "It's a small island. How far can I go?" 6 days before her disappearance, she stopped using her phone. She seemed to be on autopilot, but because those closest to her had no idea about her past, they brushed it off as stress from the storms. She could have already been transitioning into a fugue state for several days before it eventually took over. Hannah was a strong swimmer, and for some reason she was drawn to the water when she was in a fugue state. She had mentioned after her 2011 disappearance that water helped her to find herself. Back on St. Thomas, crews searched desperately for 2 days before the search had to be called off because Hurricane Maria was touching down. Even worse than Irma, Maria brought on heavy winds and rain, and once again battering St. Thomas. After the hurricane passed, the search was taken up again by boat and helicopter. All 80 islands in the area were searched with no sign of Hannah. Other theories that were run down were that she may have swum to one of the other islands, or been picked up by a local boater. The days leading up to Hurricane Maria were a flurry of activity, and it could have been possible that she'd been lost in the shuffle. Her disappearance in New York demonstrated that she was very resourceful and could draw from previous knowledge to keep her safe. Her mother routinely visits St. Thomas, and everyone on the island knows what Hannah looks like. Her mother remains optimistic that one day Hannah will pop up somewhere and remember who she is. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. On January 27, 2017, Elaine Park got in her car and disappeared in the early morning hours. The 20-year-old had spent the night at her on and off boyfriend's house in Calabasas, Los Angeles, California. Her boyfriend, Div Campari, said the two had seen a movie the night before, and when they went to bed, everything seemed normal. However, around 4 a.m., Elaine seemed to have woken up abruptly and was experiencing a panic attack. She told him she wanted to leave, and she did around 6 a.m. Div was the son of a wealthy businessman and lived with his parents in a high-end, gated community. She was seen leaving in her car by security cameras at the house, as well as a license plate scanner on her way out of the gated community. This was the last confirmed sighting of Elaine. Elaine Park had been born on September 24, 1996, and she grew up in La Crescenta, California. A small community outside of LA, the community was described as tight-knit, and everyone knows everyone kind of community. Elaine was an incredibly artistic person. She had a sweet and bubbly personality that drew people to her. Elaine was on the cheerleading team in high school, and she was active in her school's theater program. She loved acting, singing, dance, poetry, and had dreams of breaking into Hollywood as an actress. She'd already had a few minor roles under her belt in ER, Desperate Housewives, and Crazy Stupid Love. Elaine was coming off of a rough year. She had recently dropped out of college, was laid off from her job, and had struggled to cope with her parents' divorce. She was living with her mom, Susan, in La Crescenta, and her mother had seen her the day before her disappearance. She said that Elaine had asked to borrow $20 and told her that she was going out with Div. Her mother gave her the money, and Elaine left. It was about an hour's drive from La Crescenta to Calabasas, and she arrived around 7 p.m. Elaine texted her mom when she arrived and told her that she would be going to the movies. The two spent a few hours hanging out, and at 10:30 p.m., they took an Uber to the movie theater in Calabasas Commons. They returned via Uber at around 1 a.m., which was confirmed with security footage, and they went to bed shortly after. Div said that it was around 4 a.m. when Elaine started acting erratically. He said that she was shaking and singing, and he said that to him she seemed to be having a panic attack. He said that he tried to get her to stay, but she wanted to leave and he didn't stop her. She was picked up leaving on the security cameras, and her body language doesn't indicate any sign of stress, agitation, or fear. Later that day, her mother sent her a text message, but initially she wasn't alarmed when she didn't get a response from her daughter. She also wasn't concerned when Elaine didn't come home that night, as she had assumed she was still with Div. Elaine was in her 20s and wasn't in the habit of telling her mom where she was all the time. January 30th, she tried to call Elaine several times throughout the day and noticed that some of the calls went straight to voicemail, while other times it would ring once or twice before going to voicemail. It was very unlike Elaine to not respond to calls, and it was at this point that Susan contacted Glendale Police Department to file a missing person report. Elaine was also very active on social media, and her social media activity was completely halted on January 27th. It was a huge red flag for Elaine's friends and family, who now were increasingly concerned about the whereabouts of Elaine. The first time Susan called to file a report, she had been told to wait a couple days, and she had to call back again on January 31st to get a missing person report filed and start an investigation. There was now a 4-day window from the last time she had seen her daughter. The investigation began and the Uber drivers were interviewed, and neither noticed anything unusual with Elaine or Div. They said that the couple seemed happy, were having a good time, and nothing stood out. Her family said that Elaine had never suffered from panic attacks in the past and thought it was unusual that she would suddenly have one the night she disappeared. There were questions about drug use, though Div denied that they had used any substances. Friends of Elaine said that she had been known to experiment in the past, but wasn't a frequent drug user. Police said that Dib cooperated fully with officers, and he wasn't considered a suspect. Police focused on using her cell phone ping to locate her, and on February 5th, her phone pinged off of a cell tower in Malibu. 9 days after her disappearance, officers located her gray 2015 Honda Civic. It was found seemingly abandoned along the Pacific Coast Highway. It was a heavily populated area with houses and businesses all along the beach. Her car was found unlocked, keys in the ignition with the lights on, and a dead battery. All of her belongings were laid out inside the car, which included her laptop, cell phone, and money. It was unclear why it was in Malibu. It wasn't an area of LA that Elaine frequented. Except for the battery, the car was fine. There was also no sign of struggle in the vehicle forensically. Bloodhounds were brought in and they didn't pick up her scent in the area, and cadaver dogs also went through the car and didn't indicate anything suspicious. It also didn't seem likely that her car had been there long. Residents in the area said they would have noticed a car not moving for several days with the lights on. Also, because the car had been found unlocked, with the keys in the ignition, it led officers to believe that the car had dumped and maybe someone had intended to have the car stolen. Detectives searched the coastal area near the car for 2 weeks and found nothing else related to Elaine's disappearance. Officers didn't release how much cash was found in Elaine's car, but Elaine's mother noted it was more than the $20 she had given her. Her family says that they don't think that Elaine left willingly, and she didn't have the means to run away and start a new life. The Glendale Police Department made a huge mistake, which may have undermined the entire investigation. They returned the vehicle and all of the personal items found in the car to Elaine's family without taking fingerprints or DNA samples from any of the items, though they told media that they felt that the disappearance was suspicious and likely foul play. The Parks family hired their own private detective, but he wasn't able to locate any new information that led to finding Elaine. Police are asking anyone from Calabasas and Malibu to check their security or dash cams from January 28, 2017 to February 2, 2017. Elaine was last seen a light gray sweatshirt, denim shorts, and white athletic shoes. She also has waist-length brown hair with blonde tips. She is of Korean descent, standing at 5'5" and very petite. She has 4 distinct tattoos. On her left arm, she has a moth on her forearm and a cow skull on her upper arm. On her right arm, she has a dagger and a rose on her left shoulder. She also might be wearing a gold necklace with the letter E. It was her favorite necklace, and it wasn't found with her belongings. If you have any information, please contact the number on this poster. In early May 1994, in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, 18-year-old Clea Hall was dropped off at her clerical job by her mother. She was most often called Clea and worked for Dr. Larry Amos, who ran a non-profit organization out of his house. The team was close to graduating high school, and she only had 2 weeks left, and then she had plans of becoming a pediatrician. She had a summer internship lined up in Boston and was her parents to pick her up when she was finished. Clea called at 8. One of her parents to pick her up when she was finished. Clea called at 8 p.m. and her mother answered. Clea asked if anyone had called the house for her, and no one had, so Clea said she was almost finished and she would call again for her ride. Her mother hung up and waited for that call, but ended up dozing off on the couch. The phone never rang again, and her mother Laurel woke up with a start at 12:45 a.m. when her husband came home from work. Laurel immediately called Dr. Amos, and she said that he answered on the first ring. He noted that Clea had left at 8:30 p.m. and got into a vehicle he didn't recognize. At first, her mother assumed that she might have called up a friend and went somewhere with them. She stayed up all night waiting, but Clea never walked through the door. Her family had hoped that she would be at school the following day, but deep down her mother knew that something wasn't right. Clea never took off. She was an incredibly responsible teenager. She was an honor student, top of her class, and was given the commencement speech at her graduation ceremony in 2 weeks. She worked hard to save her college and was active in her church and multiple academic clubs. She never went anywhere without telling anyone. Clea also didn't have her purse or any ID. None of her belongings were missing. There was no way she had planned on leaving for an extended amount of time. Clea's brother called home from school the following morning and let his parents know that she wasn't there, and they called the police to report her missing. Unfortunately, like so many of these cases, police told Clea's mother to wait 24 hours and hold tight in case she came back. When the allotted 24 hours passed, an official police report was filed, but it contained very little information, and a search was not started immediately. Clea's parents organized their own search party with community members, and after a few days, law enforcement got involved. Clea's parents were upset that the Pine Bluff Police Department didn't take Clea's disappearance seriously right from the beginning. No evidence was found in the search. It was as if she had just vanished. A person of interest was her employer, Dr. Larry Amos. He had been the last to see her alive, and he had left the state the following morning after her disappearance. He also wasn't cooperative with the police, and he wouldn't allow officers to search the home for evidence. When asked to take a polygraph test, he also refused. However, Clea had worked for Dr. Amos for over a year and had never expressed any concerns over her safety, felt he was aggressive or off, and she enjoyed her job, and there had never been any complaints. Clea had a boy that she'd been interested in dating, and he was also considered a person of interest. He fully cooperated with police and had his vehicle searched, which yielded no evidence of Clea. He also took a polygraph test and was cleared as a suspect 18 years later in 2012. 2 construction workers came forward with new statements. One said that he'd been hired to work on the home of Dr. Amos in the late 90s. While he'd been working, He noticed some of the insulation was stained with what looked to him to be blood. The other worker had been hired to do some landscaping, and he said that when the wind blew a particular direction, he would smell a horrible odor, unlike anything he had ever smelled before. It is unclear why the men had waited so long to come forward to the police, but it was enough to get a court order to access the house for the first time. Police brought in cadaver dogs, took drywall and insulation samples, and searched the property. The search sparked a hope that there would be answers or justice for Clea. However, something happened during the police search. For bags of evidence were removed from the home, and an officer was charged with maintaining chain of custody. He had been expected to bring the evidence straight to the forensic lab. However, for some reason, he went home with the evidence and decided to leave it in his trunk overnight. This led to all 4 bags of evidence being dismissed as the chain of custody had been broken and the integrity of the evidence had been compromised. The officers involved were reprimanded, and it was a crushing blow to the investigation. They couldn't go back, and without any new evidence, the case went cold. Police now believe that Clea was a victim of foul play, and tragically her mother agrees. Laura Hall said that she is certain Clea was murdered. Clea has been missing for 27 years, with no new leads since 2012. Before we continue, 90% of you haven't subscribed to our channel, so if you like this video, please subscribe. It motivates us to make more content for you. Okay, let's continue. January 15th, 1980 was a cold, dark winter evening. Barbara Mae Tucker, a business undergraduate at MT Hood Community College in Gresham, Oregon, was the youngest of 7 siblings. Standing 5 feet 11 inches tall, Barb was an asset to her high school basketball team. The 19-year-old was heading into campus to attend an evening class. She told her mother earlier that day she had hoped that class would be dismissed early, so that she could visit a friend and have ice cream. However, Barbara never made it to class, or to that friend's house later that evening. It was very odd, as it was unlike Barbara to miss a class. No one heard from her for the rest of the evening. The following morning, a student was cutting through a wooded area on the way to campus and made a grisly discovery. Barbara's body was discovered. She had been rolled into a patch of bushes, and she had been savagely beaten and sexually assaulted. The violent crime shocked the community, but during the investigation, it was discovered that there likely been several witnesses to the attack. Several vehicles saw Barbara run out of the wooded and attempt to flag people down, but no one stopped. Others said that they saw a man follow her out of the bushes and grab her, but again, no one intervened. Some were saying they thought it was a college prank or something like that, but it wasn't. No one could identify the man that had been seen with Barbara. It had been dark, and there had been nothing that stood out to witnesses. Without a description, there was little hope of finding a suspect. Barbara's case went cold for 4 decades. In 2015, a detective was assigned the cold case, and he promised to get justice for Barbara. A DNA sample from the original investigation was sent off to Parban Nanolabs, and it took several years to narrow in on a suspect using reverse family engineering technology, but they were able to locate a suspect. 58-year-old Robert Plimpton. He would have been 16 at the time of the crime, and he was arrested during a traffic stop. After his arrest, it was discovered that Plimpton had a history of violence towards women. In 1997, a woman had accused him of driving to a secluded area and attack her, but she managed to escape alive. Though he had been arrested, his charges were dropped due to insufficient evidence. Plimpton was charged with first-degree murder and second-degree murder and sexual assault. He may have other victims out there, and his DNA is being tested in other cold cases in the area. He has pleaded not guilty, and there will be a trial later this year. On May 15, 1988, 8-year-old Joshua Harmon was playing in the woods behind his apartment complex in Roswell, Georgia. He was still exploring the area. The family had only moved in 3 weeks ago. It was a warm evening, and many children were playing in the area. Joshua loved nature, and his favorite place to play was in the woods. Joshua was expected to come home for supper, and when he failed to show up, his mother looked for him, calling out his name in the neighborhood. Joshua had a learning disability, and he was easily frightened and wasn't comfortable around strangers. He never stayed too far from home and certainly never out of earshot. His mother called the Roswell police to report him missing, and though they responded quickly, it wasn't initially thought to be concerning. While canvassing, they discovered Joshua had last been seen around 7 p.m. He had gone to a neighbor's house and asked if a little boy could come play. But the family was having supper, so the boy wasn't allowed out. Joshua told him that he would be playing out in the woods if wanted to join him after supper, and that was the last encounter anyone had with a child. As night crept closer, the search began to take a more concerned tone. Officers even searched the area between his old house and the new apartment in case he might have gotten confused or lost. But there was no sign of the child. The search continued for 48 hours. Officers combed the 60-acre forest in the surrounding area. On May 17th, an officer entering the scene tripped and saw Joshua's body under a log with dirt and pine straw hiding him from view. Joshua had been struck over the head and strangled to death. Despite an extensive investigation, the case went cold. His mother, Sherry, spent decades keeping Joshua's investigation alive. Sherry passed in October of 2020. In February 2021, cold case detectives had decided to reopen the investigation and decided to start from scratch. With the permission of the family, Joshua was exhumed and forensic experts were able to recover DNA evidence. The sample was input into national database, and they got a hit from a previously convicted felon. And on July 21, 2021, they made an arrest. Known child predator, 56-year-old James Coates, was arrested while taking an Uber. Coates had previously already served a 20-year sentence for a separate incident in 1993. In 1988, Coates was living in the same housing complex in Roswell, but was never considered a suspect until now. Coates will remain in custody until his trial. Roswell PD is working to determine if there are any additional victims. Joshua's family said the arrest is bittersweet but thanked officers for the dedication to solve Joshua's murder. On June 1, 1989 in Las Vegas, Nevada, 14-year-old Stephanie Isaacson was getting ready for school. It was almost summer break, and the teen was excited about summer. She said goodbye to her dad and left the house at 6:30 a.m. Stephanie used the same route every day, cutting through a sandlot shortcut to get to El Dorado High School. All seemed normal throughout the day until her father came home from work and noticed Stephanie wasn't home. It wasn't that late yet, so he'd call the school and see if Stephanie had been held up or been asked to stay late. It was then that the school informed him that Stephanie hadn't arrived for classes that day. He then called several Stephanie's friends. All of them said that they hadn't seen her that day and didn't know where she was. Police were called and an aggressive investigation began right away. A search party went out retracing Stephanie's walk to school. Her books and backpack were found first. It was discovered that Stephanie hadn't made it far from home. While searching the empty sandlot near her house, Stephanie's body was discovered. She had been sexually assaulted, bludgeoned, and strangled. Yet despite best efforts from officers, a suspect was never identified. It had been the early morning when she was walking to school, and officers suspected that her attacker had studied her routine and waited for her in the secluded sandlot. No one saw anything or anyone suspicious. Despite Beth's efforts from detectives, the case went cold. Over the years, the case would be reopened and evaluated. There was a DNA sample recovered from the crime scene, and over the years it had been checked and rechecked with no match. Over time, there was only one more opportunity for DNA testing. A local man came forward. He wanted to pay for one case to be sent off to Ortham Labs. He had seen the success for reverse genetic genealogy family trees being created to solve crimes, and he wanted to help any cold case at the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. He would fund the lab costs. The first case that came to mind for the LVMPD was Stephanie's cold case. They sent Ortham 15 cells for genome sequencing, and as we have seen in so many cases, they were able to match with distant relatives sourced from public databases, and from there they were able to piece together a family tree. They were able to find a distant cousin to their suspect, and after 32 years, they were able to make an identification. Las Vegas resident Darren Roy Marchand. Marchand had lived nearby at the time of Stephanie's murder, and detectives believes it was likely a random attack. He had previously been arrested in connection to the 1986 murder of 24-year-old Nanette Vanderberg. She had been murdered in her home, and though they had an eyewitness placing Marchand near the area, There was no evidence to connect him as DNA testing wasn't available at the time, and he was released and the case was dismissed. With the positive identification of Marchand in Stephanie's case, they were able to test samples from both cases and were able to determine Marchand had killed both Stephanie and Nanette. Marchand committed suicide in 1995 at age 29. He would have been 20 when he killed Annette, and 23 when he killed Stephanie. Stephanie's mother said in a statement that she was glad to finally know who killed her daughter, but was disappointed that there would be no justice in her murder. She said that she never believed the case would be solved. The LMVPD said in a statement that anyone interested in making a similar donation to help solve a cold case is welcome to at www.lvmpdfoundation.org and designate the donation to homicide cold case. Paramedics are promptly sent to the scene. The park is completely dark, and the scant illumination from nearby streetlights makes it nearly impossible to assess the situation. Both victims have life-threatening injuries and appear to have been left for dead. The severity of the attack makes it difficult for emergency services to determine the victims' genders. The police arrive shortly afterward and need to identify the pair. A search of one of the victim's pockets reveals documentation showing him to be a young man called Robert Maltby. This documentation also provides officers with an address for him. They still don't know who the other person is. Investigators go straight to Robert Maltby's house, and his family confirm that the other person with him is most likely his girlfriend, Sophie Lancaster. The hunt was now on to find the personal persons responsible for this shocking and brutal attack. The assault on Robert and Sophie had taken place in the skate park in Stobble Park, so the police began their search there for any evidence that could lead them to whoever had done this. They found a rucksack, several bottles and cans, 2 pools of blood, and bloody footprints. All this evidence was vital, as it could help the investigating team determine who had been at the skate park. While the forensic search of the area got underway, Detective Chief Inspector Dean Holden and his team began to focus on other lines of inquiry. They needed to identify key witnesses that could help them fill in the gaps and paint a broader picture of what had transpired in the early morning hours of August 11th. Officers fanned out and conducted door-to-door inquiries in and around the town. In the first few hours of the investigation, around 15 young people had been interviewed. They were reluctant to talk and provide any accounts to the police. Due to the apparent fear of talking, DCI Holden decided to change strategy. He made the decision to bring in junior officers, ones who wouldn't normally take a central role in an investigation as complex and difficult as this one. The role of these junior officers was to build up a rapport and trust with the young witnesses and get them to open up about what it was they had seen that night. Sylvia Lancaster woke up early on Saturday morning and had gone to the gym and done some shopping. After arriving home, she opened her front door and found a card lying on the floor. It was from the police requesting that she call them immediately. Confused and concerned, she picked up the phone and there were 14 messages on the answering machine. She had only been gone for an hour. Before she could dial the number on the card, her son Adam called. He explained that his sister and Robert had been the victims of a horrific attack and were now in intensive care fighting for their lives. Adam and Sylvia went straight to Rochdale Infirmary. When they entered the intensive care units, they saw their beloved Sophie. A big chunk of her hair had been pulled out and she had been kicked repeatedly in the head and body. Nobody could understand why anybody would want to hurt Robert and Sophie in such a brutal way. Sophie Lancaster had been born on the November 26, 1986 to parents John and Sylvia, the youngest child of the couple. Her mother described her as quite shy and introverted, but she could be chatty and bubbly if in the right mood and around the right people. After attending the local school, she had taken a gap year and wanted to study English at Accrington and Rossendale College. When she was 17, she began a relationship with Roberts. They both shared a big interest in and attachment to the goth subculture and used this to express themselves. Her interest in the alternative scene and style had started around the age of 11, and she would later become a big part of the alternative community. Both were intelligent, sensitive, and avoided trouble, sticking closely to their friendship group and to each other. At the age of 20, Sophie moved 7 miles to the town of Baycop to live with Robert. It was in this quaint community that the feeling of safety and security residents had was shattered. As the investigation moved forward, the young officers had started making progress with the witnesses. It became apparent that there were 5 key individuals. A 15-year-old witness told police they were running over and just kicking her in the head and jumping up and down on her head. News traveled fast in the small town of Bacup, and it soon became common knowledge exactly who the police were looking for. By the Sunday evening, Sylvia said she knew all their names and where they lived. 3 of the suspects were arrested at their homes, and the other 2 handed themselves into the police the following day. When the suspects were interviewed at Burnley Police Station, they initially denied any involvement. But as the questioning continued, 2 of the suspects admitted they had been at the park that night and also admitted to hitting Robert Maltby once. None admitted to the attack on Sophie Lancaster. They also would not confess to a group attack against either of them. It soon came to light that 2 of the suspects, 16-year-old Ryan Herbert and 15-year-old Brendan Harris, had a history of violence. In a previous incident, they had kicked and punched somebody to the ground, which luckily didn't result in any major injuries. As the questioning of the boys continued, a team was dispatched to their homes to retrieve the clothes they had been wearing that night. Ryan Herbert's clothes appeared to have blood on them. The scientific analysis would be vital, as with the other boys' clothes. It wasn't clear whether certain stains were blood or not. Before long, there would be another lead. Investigators looked into the movements of Robert Maltby and Sophie Lancaster on the night of the attack. They were able to identify a garage on Market Street that they had called in at whilst they were heading to the park. When looking further into the garage, they discovered in the early morning hours, within an hour of the attack in Staveley Park, a male had been seen near the garage hose pipe and appeared to be washing blood off his hands and face. Unfortunately for the police, the CCTV system wasn't working, so no footage had been gathered. As they continued to investigate despite this appearing to be a promising lead, it turned out to be unconnected. The man had been assaulted in a completely separate incident, and this was corroborated by several witnesses. Despite the setback, DCI Holden's hunch to use younger officers started to pay off. One witness came forward and said they had seen the attack on Robert and Sophie. One day after the attack on Sunday, August 12th, all 5 boys, Ryan Herbert, Brendan Harris, Joseph Home, Daniel Home, and Daniel Mallet, all aged 15-16, were charged with grievous bodily harm with intent for the assault on Robert Maltby. Due to insufficient evidence at the time, they weren't charged with the attack on Sophie Lancaster. But as it happened straight after the attack on Roberts, officers were relatively satisfied that either the whole group or a few individuals from it had attacked Sophie. As they had no history of violence, the other 3 suspects were released on bail. Ryan Herbert and Brendan Harris were remanded in custody at a Young Offenders Institute. In the first week since the attack, it was hoped that Sophie and Robert would recover. Whilst Robert began to show signs of improvement and would later come out of his coma, Sophie's condition was significantly worse. She was suffering from brain damage and her prognosis wasn't good. DCI Holden decided that in order to gather more evidence about the extent of her injuries, he needed to use a new technique. He had a forensic pathologist visit her while she was in the intensive care unit. The medical practitioners who were looking after her could give their expert advice on what the injuries were, and the pathologists could give advice on how the injuries had been caused. DCI Holden wanted to ensure that the full extent of her injuries was known before they began to heal, thus giving the pathologist a chance to give their opinion on how they had been sustained. The pathologist concluded that the head injuries Sophie had sustained had come from being kicked by more than one person. Based on the forensic evidence and the testimony of the witness, the police now had enough to charge for the assault on Sophie Lancaster. All 5 boys were brought back into custody. Despite the best efforts of the medical staff caring for her, Sophie continued to deteriorate. 10 days after the attack on August 21st, she was sent for a brain scan. Tragically, it showed no function. Her family were faced with the unbearable, turning off her life support and saying goodbye to their beloved Sophie. Due to all the wires and machines, her mother couldn't hold her. So the night before, Sylvia stayed at her bedside and did her daughter's hair for her, as it was the only part of her body she could touch. As the curtains around her bed were pulled shut, her mother lay down with her and held her as she died. Sophie succumbing to her injuries meant this was no longer an assault investigation. This was a major murder inquiry. DCI Holden and his team were determined to get justice for her and Robert. On suspicion of murder, all 5 boys were interviewed again. What became apparent was that the dynamics of the group had now changed with Sophie's death. Members of the group who might not have attacked Sophie themselves were now keen to say who had done what and distance themselves from her murder. Brendan Harris told officers that Ryan Herbert had committed the attack on Sophie completely by himself. Harris said that Herbert had volley-kicked Sophie in the back of the head and made a comment that as she was a witness, she had to be killed. Brendan Harris also denied that he had attacked Sophie. Ryan Herbert answered no comments throughout his interview. The results of the forensic came back and Ryan Herbert's clothes had the most forensic evidence on them. He had blood belonging to both Sophie and Robert splashed up the inside of his trousers, as well as on the bottom of his trainers. The forensic scientists concluded that this blood could have only got onto his clothes and shoes if he was either walking in a pool of blood, or more likely, stomping on the victims while they were bleeding profusely. The prime suspect for Sophie's murder was Herbert. While he was in custody at Lancaster Young Offenders Institute, his phone calls were monitored. He called his mother and she told him that although Sophie had died, he had nothing to worry about if he wasn't involved. Herbert responded, "Well, I was..." DCI Holden's team had to make a formal application to the prison service to allow them to use this call as evidence at a potential trial. The police booked the van that Herbert and Harris were traveling in from the Young Offenders Institute. During the conversation in the back of the van, Herbert made reference to kicking Sophie Lancaster like a football. This matched with the findings of the pathologist, who argued that the injuries had been sustained from being severely kicked in the head, alongside the witness statements. Although Herbert had taken a central role, police believed that all 5 boys had played a role in the attack and so bared an equal responsibility for what had happened. If they could prove joint enterprise, whether or not every single boy had physically attacked her wouldn't matter. Ryan Herbert, Brendan Harris, Joseph Holm, Daniel Holm, and Daniel Mallet were charged with the murder of Sophie Lancaster. By early November, Robert's condition had improved to the point that he was able to leave hospital. But the mental and physical scars of the brutal attack he had endured, coupled with the murder of his beloved girlfriend, were huge. He was, however, determined that he would say goodbye to Sophie, and so joined loved ones at her funeral. The trial was set for March 2008. The lawyers acting for Ryan Herbert tried to have the charge of murder reduced to manslaughter on the basis that he had diminished responsibility. The grounds for their argument centered around the fact that he had autism. The police had an expert on autism come to Lancashire prior to the trial, and she carried out her own assessment of him. Following this, she concluded he was not autistic. His lawyer's defense was subsequently withdrawn. The trial began at Preston Crown Court. When it came to the charge of grievous bodily harm with intent against Robert Maltby, all 5 boys entered a plea of guilty. On the first day of the arguments, a shocking twist came. Brian Herbert admitted to killing Sophie Lancaster. Following this, the police and Crown Prosecution Service made the difficult decision to withdraw the murder charge against 3 of the boys. According to DCI Holden, Herbert's submission diluted the evidence against Joseph Holm, Daniel Holm, and Daniel Mallet. And what their defense teams were arguing was that the attack on Robert and the murder of Sophie were 2 separate incidents, and that whilst they had been involved in the first, they hadn't been involved in the second. For their roles in the attack on Robert Maltby and following a plea of guilty for this charge, Joseph Holm was sentenced to 5 years 10 months. His brother, Daniel Holm, got 5 years 10 months too, and Daniel Mallet received 4 years 4 months. Robert Maltby was not in court when his attackers were sentenced, but a lawyer read out a statement on his behalf. "Before all this happened, I was settled into a life quite independent. Now I'm finding the whole world a terrifying place." This meant that the prosecution now had to prove that Brendan Harris had murdered Sophie. It would soon become clearer, and the police and prosecutors were eventually able to piece together what they believed had happened that night. Sophie and Robert had been at a friend's house on the outskirts of Bacup, and they had had some drinks as the night had progressed. They left at around 11:40 p.m. and set off on foot to head back to their home in Bacup Town Center. They made a slight diversion and went to the garage on Market Street to buy some cigarettes. It was here that they were seen by a group of young girls who were interested in their alternative style. After striking up a friendly conversation and talking, they agreed to join the girls at a second location on Park Road, yards away from the entrance to Stubley Park. Before long, they decided to head to the skate park. When they got there, the 5 suspects were already there. While Robert and Sophie were getting on very well with the group of girls, the group of boys, in reference to Robert, made comments like, "Let's batter him." Brendan Harris stepped forward and punched Robert in the face before the other boys joined in and proceeded to kick him to the ground. As the attack escalated, the other people in the park fled. Sophie went to hold her boyfriend after he had been savagely kicked about the head. It was then that Harrison Herbert went on to attack Sophie Lancaster. What was not clear was why. Why had this group of boys targeted a young couple who were just going about their business? Sophie's mother Sylvia's theory was that because Robert and Sophie were alternative, this was the motive for the attack. During the long hours at Sophie's bedside in hospital, Sylvia had decided that when her daughter was better, they would go into schools and talk to young people about difference and how it is okay to be who you are and express yourself through your own unique style. Tragically, Sylvia would never get to do this with Sophie. Harris's defense was that Herbert had committed the attack on Sophie on his own, and that the forensic evidence didn't link him directly to the crime. Despite the lack of forensics, the police did have a witness testimony saying they had seen Harris kicking Sophie. They also had the expert advice of the pathologist who had examined Sophie while she was in the intensive care unit, concluding that the attack had been committed by at least 2 people. The jury had reached their verdict. Brendan Harris was found guilty of the murder of Sophie Lancaster, a crime that Ryan Herbert had already admitted to. The following day, Ryan Herbert and Brandon Harris were sentenced. Brandon Harris was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 18 years that he must serve before he can be considered for parole. Ryan Herbert received life in prison with a minimum term of 16 years 3 months. His sentence would later be reduced by 9 months following an appeal, arguing that a big enough reduction had not been given following his guilty plea. In February 2020, it was announced that following progress he had made in prison, Ryan Herbert's minimum jail term had been reduced by a year. Following the sentencing, Sylvia gave a statement outside the court. "I stand outside this house of justice, not as Sophie's mother, but as her voice that was cruelly silenced in a single, mindless act. I hope, therefore, that as a society, we can use what has happened to reflect on where we are going and what changes we need to make to prevent others suffering in this way." Detective Superintendent Mick Gradwell of Lancashire Police said it was one of the most violent murders he had come across in his entire career. "I do not think Herbert and Harris have recognized how violent the attack was. They have just done it without thinking. But they seem to have enjoyed it and carried on remorselessly kicking at 2 very defenseless people who were unable to protect themselves because of the level of violence inflicted upon them. I am very critical of some of the parents involved. I really don't think they have taken completely seriously how repulsive this incident was." In 2017, Robert Maltby gave his first full-length interview since the attack. Following Sophie's funeral, his mental health declined and he became reclusive. He received treatment and eventually felt ready to visit Sophie's grave and return to Studebaker Park. He studied illustration with animation at Manchester School of Art and moved there for his final year. But none of these moments felt like breakthroughs for him. They were both incredibly profound and entirely meaningless. There is no one big thing that snaps you out of it. It has been gradual and hard. To him, the media focus on their appearance in the aftermath of the crime felt like a form of victim blaming. Besides being patronizing, the goth thing was also an oversimplification of a much broader social issue. Life hasn't progressed in these poor areas. There is still that dissatisfaction, that stagnation. These areas are still forgotten, and forgotten people will feel like, well, it can breed nihilism. I've never tried to demonize the attackers, and in many ways, they were victims. In 2014, Sylvia Lancaster was awarded an OBE by the Prince of Wales for her work in tackling hate crime. Despite the brutal murder of her daughter, Sylvia was determined that her death would not be in vain, nor would her daughter be forgotten. A charity was set up called the Sophie Lancaster Foundation, aimed at eliminating discrimination against people from alternative subcultures. The charity works to promote tolerance and acceptance for others. The foundation's mission is to eradicate prejudice, hatred, and intolerance, a fitting tribute to the intelligent, sensitive, and kind-hearted Sophie Lancaster. On January 3, 1956, 3 boys went hiking near Wadsworth Park, northwest of Great Falls, Montana. As they walked down a dirt road, they discovered a car parked between 2 trees. The vehicle's radio, headlights, emergency brake, and ignition switch were all engaged. Inside, they found a man with his hands bound behind his back using what would later be identified as his own belt. He had been shot in the head. The man was 18-year-old Lloyd Dwayne Bogle, the owner of the car. Originally from Waco, Texas, Dwayne was an airman second class who had been serving at nearby Malmstrom Air Force Base for the past 8.5 months, assigned to the 29th Fighter Interceptor Squadron. Dwayne was a graduate of Waco High School, loved by everyone in his family for his charm and sense of humor. Authorities did not believe that robbery was the motive for Dwayne's murder, as his expensive camera was still inside of his car and $5 in cash was found on his body. They instead feared a much worse motive, kidnapping. When the worried parents of Dwayne's girlfriend, Patricia Patty Kitzski, came forward after Dwayne's body was found, reporting that Dwayne and Patty had spent the previous evening together and that Patty had never returned home. There was no sign of Patty in the immediate vicinity of the car, so authorities began searching out from the crime scene looking for her. Patty would not be located until the following day, January 4th, when a county road worker found her body at the bottom of a rocky ravine along Vineyard Road, 5 miles outside of Great Falls and nearly 8 miles from where Dwayne had been killed and Patty had presumably been abducted. The trail of blood that ran down the ravine indicated that Patty's body had rolled down to the location where it was found from the gravel road above. Patty had been just 16 years old and a junior at Great Falls High School when she was killed. She was popular in her neighborhood and in school, and according to one of her friends, she did not have a mean bone in her body. Her classmates described her as witty, fun-loving, and bubbly, and her sister said she was always smiling. Patty was seemingly good at everything she tried, including ballet and tap dancing. Patty and Dwayne had only recently started dating after meeting at Patty's cousin's wedding a month before they were killed. They bonded in part over their shared love of music and dancing. While they had not been together for very long, Patty and Dwayne were spinning with each other. The couple had already begun discussing marriage, and Dwayne had spent Christmas of 1955 as a guest in the Kitzski family home. They spent all of their free time together, and the Kitzskis already considered Dwayne to be like part of their family. Newspapers reported shortly after the murders that Patty's parents had not contacted authorities as soon as she failed to return home on the evening of January 2nd because they assumed that she and Dwayne had eloped. However, according to Patty's sister, Darlene, while the couple was in love and extremely happy together, they were still getting to know each other, and Patty was determined to go to college, so an elopement was not immediately considered. Her parents had panicked when Patty, who was responsible and considerate, failed to return home by her 10 p.m. curfew, which she always adhered to. They began calling around to Patty's older sisters to see if she had gone to one of their homes, but she was not with any of them. When they could not find Patty anywhere she conceivably would have gone, they then began considering the possibility that Patty had eloped, as her oldest sister had done when she was Patty's age. Patty and Dwayne had last been seen at Pete's Drive in restaurant drinking cokes on the night of January 2nd. According to the employees of the drive-in, they arrived there around 8:30 p.m. and left a little after 9. They were alone in Dwayne's car. The location where Dwayne and his car were found was used as a local lover's lane, leading police to believe that Dwayne and Patty had driven there on their own accord, and their killer had found them there and forced them out of the vehicle. Authorities believed that Dwayne and Patty were both killed by the same person due to the circumstances of the case and the manner in which they were killed. Both Patty and Dwayne appeared to have been forced to kneel before they were shot in the head from behind. Authorities did not initially believe Patty had been sexually assaulted in any way because she was found fully clothed save for the one shoe that came off of her foot as she rolled down the embankment, and the initial inspection of her body was inconclusive. However, further testing and examination showed injuries consistent with rape, a conclusion that would be further validated by more advanced technology applied to the evidence decades later. The coroner believed Dwayne survived for several hours after he was shot. He placed the time of the shooting sometime between 10 p.m. and midnight and Dwayne's time of death sometime between 2 and 4 a.m. Authorities were dedicated to the investigation, and a massive effort into identifying the killer was launched. Sheriff DJ Leeper purchased a polygraph machine with his own money to aid in the investigation and arranged for an examiner from Seattle to come to Great Falls to oversee its use. 10 officers worked on the case full-time. Authorities began looking for anyone with a motive to harm either Dwayne or Patty. Patty's mother, Catherine, told police that when she had seen Dwayne the day before his body was discovered, he had seemed moody enough that she asked him what was bothering him. He told her that he was bothered about an argument he had recently had with a friend from the base and just couldn't shake his bad mood. Authorities held the man he had this argument with, who they did not publicly identify for questioning, but eventually had to release him after they could not tie him to the murders. Police could ultimately not identify any personal motive for someone to want to kill Dwayne or Patty, which limited the avenues of inquiry in the investigation. They therefore began looking for men who had been out drinking on the night of January 2nd and trying to identify individuals who kept guns in their vehicle. 2 witnesses came forward with evidence that tied someone to the murder, and this individual was very nearly arrested based on their testimony until the witnesses admitted after hours of questioning that they had been lying. After 2 months, Sheriff Leeper had to end the full-time inquiry into the case without identifying the killer. The case was still investigated, but the lack of progress in it was upsetting to the sheriff. "I feel bad about it, not getting the guy who killed those 2, he told the Great Falls Tribune on the 1-year anniversary of the murders. "I guess it's just one of those things, but we're not giving up. Maybe this year we'll get him. Somewhere he made a mistake. They all do. Someday we'll find out what it was, then we'll have him." Patty's father, Henry, worked as a railroad carpenter for the Great Northern Railway, and his co-workers began raising funds to offer as a reward in the case, collecting $100 within days of the murders. Donations to the reward fund would increase in the following weeks, months, but tips and leads in the case did not. The fund had reached over $6,000 by the time it was dispersed a decade after the murders, with no one to claim it because the case had long since gone cold. Dwayne and Patty's deaths had profound impacts on their families and communities. The other members of Patty's homeroom cried together over her death for weeks. Patty's family was largely too devastated even for tears. "You couldn't even cry, my dad especially. He was just numb." Patty's sister, Darlene, would later tell the television show Hard Copy. Henry Bogle-Kitzski could not bring himself to so much as mention his daughter's death and nearly physically shut down if it were brought up. Darlene chose to focus on all of the happy memories she shared with her sister. "Those memories don't fade," she would say in 2010. Father unable to speak about his daughter's murder, her mother, Catherine, took on the responsibility of speaking to the press and interacting with authorities. She also exchanged letters with Dwayne's mother, Albuquerque Kirk Bogle, in Texas for many years, as their families were now connected through tragedy and grief. Shortly before Catherine died in 1991, police came to believe that the murderer went to see her mother, who was in the hospital. Catherine was too weak to speak in anything louder than a whisper. When Darlene asked her if she wanted to know who killed Patty, she nodded and tears ran down her face as Darlene relayed the information about the man in California. Catherine passed away the following morning. Unfortunately, this individual was ultimately eliminated as a suspect, and the investigation dragged on for 2 more decades. While efforts were made in the investigation throughout the decades that followed after Dwayne and Patty were murdered, the piece of evidence that would eventually close the case was not identified until 2001. A vaginal swab taken during Patty's autopsy was found still stored in evidence 45 years after her murder. Since technology now existed to identify DNA potentially present in that swab, it was sent to the Montana State Police Crime Lab for investigation. This analysis located a sperm cell that did not belong to Dwayne Bogle. Authorities spent the following several years comparing the DNA from that cell to more than 35 suspects that had been identified over the previous decades. Unfortunately, the DNA did not match any of these suspects. There was no match to the DNA in national criminal databases either. Amongst the eliminated suspects was infamous Boston mobster James Whitey Bulger and serial killer Edward Wayne Edwards. Bulger was considered a suspect because he had lived in the Great Falls area at the time of the murders and had been arrested there for the rape of a 15-year-old girl in 1951. Edwards was a potential suspect because he was convicted of killing two couples decades after Dwayne and Patty's murders, and he may or may not have been in the Great Falls area in early January of 1956. He denied any involvement in Patty and Dwayne's case. In 2019, investigators began working with Bode technology to use an innovative technique to try to identify the contributor of the DNA genetic genealogy. Forensic genealogists were able to compare the DNA profile from the crime scene to other DNA profiles uploaded to voluntary genealogical databases and identify distant relatives based on the amount of DNA they shared. They were able to construct a family tree, which ultimately led them to identifying a suspect. Unfortunately, the suspect was no longer alive and his remains had been cremated, preventing authorities from collecting a direct DNA sample from him. They therefore approached the man's children, who agreed to provide their DNA for comparison. Their DNA confirmed that the sperm cell found during Patty's autopsy had come from their father. On June 8, 2021, the Cascade County Sheriff's Office announced the identity of the contributor of the DNA, Kenneth Gould. While they were confident that Gould was Patty and Dwayne's killer because he was deceased and could therefore not be tried in a court of law, they were only able to name him as the most likely suspect in the case rather than definitively name him as the perpetrator. The announcement came more than 65 years after Patty and Dwayne were killed, making it the oldest cold case closed using genetic genealogy at the time. Kenneth Gould had been born and raised in Great Falls and worked as a horse trainer. In 1952, when he was 24, he had married a 16-year-old girl and started a family, eventually having 5 children. At the time of the murders, he had lived less than a mile away from the Kitzski home. He was known to ride horses throughout the area. His name was nowhere in any of the police's files on the case, and he had no known connection to either Patty or Dwayne. A month after Patty and Dwayne were killed, Gould had sold his family property. He moved to 2 other communities in Montana in the following years before moving to Missouri in 1967. Once he'd left Montana, he never returned to the state, even to visit family. He died in Oregon County, Missouri in 2007 at the age of 79. Detective Sergeant John Cadner of the Cascade County Sheriff's Office had been concerned about telling Gould's children that their late father was a suspect in such a brutal crime and asking for their DNA, but found them to be cooperative and great to work with. While they were surprised that their father, who had no criminal record, was a suspect in the case, they agreed to cooperate and provide their DNA. His daughter basically said, "You never know. Some people just have secrets that they never told anybody," Detective Sergeant Cadner said, recalling his conversation with the family. Because so much time had passed between the murders and Gould's identification, many of Patty and Dwayne's loved ones were no longer alive to hear the news. Patty's one surviving sister, Darlene, was suffering from advanced dementia by the time Gould was finally identified. The closing of the case stirred up a variety of emotions for Dwayne's family. While they were glad to have answers, Gould's identification brought up many memories and opened up a lot of emotional wounds amongst his relatives who were old enough to have known Dwayne personally. "It's like it just happened yesterday," Dwayne's niece Karen Bogle-McCarthy told the New York Times. "So if I was asked, is this great modern technology a great thing? I would say, on balance, yes, for my generation, a generation once removed. But it definitely reopens old wounds that have had a chance to cross over." Karen was speaking to the media on behalf of her family because her aunt had been in tears throughout the days following the announcement. Karen is the daughter of Dwayne's younger brother, James Jim Bogle. Jim, who had turned 15 just 6 weeks before his older brother was killed, had idolized Dwayne while he was growing up. Jim did not live to see his beloved brother's killer identified, passing away in November of 2013 due to a neurodegenerative disease shortly before his 73rd birthday. Jim had been an accomplished musician who served as a professor for almost 3 decades at Texas Tech University, where he had established a classical guitar program, retiring in 2005 to spend more time with his family after receiving his diagnosis. While the resolution of the case caused old emotional wounds to be reopened, the Bogle family appreciates Gould's identification because, according to Karen McCarthy, it conclusively allows us to stop wondering. "We are relieved to no longer have to contend with wild speculation and outlandish theories about the case." Particularly upsetting to the family were rumors that Dwayne and Patty had been killed because Dwayne had somehow gotten involved with the mob. In Great Falls, there had also been rumors that Dwayne had been involved with drug dealers back in Texas shortly after the murders occurred, allegations that investigators publicly discredited. Gould's identification not only allows the Bogle family to finally know who took Dwayne from them, it also puts an end to the decades of speculation and rumor they have had to contend with. In light of their success in closing Patty and Dwayne's case, the Cascade County Sheriff's Office is now considering establishing a dedicated cold case task force. They hope that such a task force can provide the closure they have now been able to provide the Kitzski and Bogle families. Quite frankly, that's our duty, according to Sheriff Jesse Slaughter. Our duty is to make sure that we solve these cases. On Sunday afternoon, August 27, 2005, 911 dispatchers in Syracuse, New York received a call from a distressed wife. She reported that she and her husband had argued, and he had been drinking heavily before locking himself in their bedroom the previous night. She mentioned that she had stayed at a friend's house overnight and gone to work that morning but grew concerned when he failed to show up for work. The caller was Stacy Castor, the office manager for her husband David Castor's air conditioning company. She indicated that her husband had ceased communication from the bedroom and requested a wellness check. An officer arrived and, unable to get a response from David, forcibly broke down the door. Inside, they found David lying face down on the bed, deceased. Initially, it appeared David might have committed suicide. The officer noted that Stacy was shocked and hysterical, but this wasn't the first time she had lost a husband. Her first husband, Michael Wallace, had died of a heart attack in 2000. At the time, there was little suspicion surrounding Michael's death, but authorities began to wonder if there was more to Stacy Castor's story than mere misfortune. They decided to take a deeper look into the young, twice widow. Stacy met her first husband, Michael, while at a bar in Clea, New York. They met in 1985 when Stacy was only 17. Michael, 6 years older, was described as kind of a wild guy. He loved the fast life of partying, drinking, and having a good time. The two married in 1988 and had their first daughter, Ashley, the same year. Michael had a short stint in prison for DUI charges and had cooled his partying ways. When he got out, the couple had their second daughter, Bree, in 1991, and the couple settled into a very everyday life. Michael worked at a large commercial air conditioner and Stacy worked in the billing department for an ambulance dispatch company. Money was tight for the family, but they were always able to make ends meet. Michael loved his daughters, but he had a clear favorite with his youngest, Bree. This bothered Stacy. Stacy wasn't a loving mother, she wasn't described as maternal, and she didn't seem to even like children, including her own. When Michael favored Bree over Ashley blatantly, Stacy decided she would have Ashley as her favorite. More to compete with Michael rather than putting Ashley first for her benefit as the couple neared their 10th anniversary. Their marriage was simply going through the motions. Stacy had concerns that Michael was having an affair, and she had told a friend that she wanted to get a divorce in the winter of 1999. Michael had begun getting mysterious waves of illness while he had a family function. He was described as acting unsteady, coughing, and looked swollen. Family members convinced Michael to seek medical attention, and he reluctantly went to a doctor. The doctor thought Michael was suffering from some sort of inner ear disorder because he wasn't sick consistently and it seemed to come in sporadic waves. On January 11, 2000, 12-year-old Ashley came home from school with her sister and found her father on the couch. Ashley called her mother at work and said that her father was acting weird and making funny faces. Stacy came home and found Michael unconscious. Stacy called an ambulance, and though first responders were able to restore a pulse en route to the hospital, Michael Wallace was pronounced deceased before arriving. Doctors said that Michael had died from a heart attack and didn't deem the death as suspicious. However, Michael was only 35, and other than the mysterious medical issues, he had been extremely healthy. His family wanted an autopsy performed, but Stacy refused. Now a widow at 29, Stacy buried her husband with a quick funeral and moved on with her life after Michael's death. Stacy became a distant parent, though she had never been a very hands-on mom. Being a single parent gave her new freedoms in addition to a bit of life insurance money of $55. She was able to relax from the responsibilities of parenthood and being a wife. In 2001, she was introduced to David Castor. David was everything her first husband had not been. David was responsible, he didn't drink, he didn't party, and he was financially stable, owning his own company. David was recently divorced and had an adult son from his first marriage. The two were married in 2003, and Stacy took over much of the business as his office manager. The two didn't have a passionate marriage, but it seemed to bring the two comfort. Stacy enjoyed financial stability and David had companionship. An odd aspect of the relationship was that David didn't want any more children and didn't make it a secret that he resented having to share his life with two young girls. He'd made it clear that he had one son and he wasn't interested in being a father figure to the Wallace girls. The weekend before David's death, the couple got into an argument allegedly over how they were going to spend their second wedding anniversary. Stacy sent the girls away to a friend's house and the couple continued arguing until she left as well. Stacy told investigators that David had been depressed over his father's recent passing, though those who knew David felt that the story was unlike the man that they knew. There were two glasses on the nightstand in with David, one filled with neon green liquid and the other brandy. There was also an empty bottle of cranberry juice. The green fluid was determined to be antifreeze, which is highly toxic, and an open bottle of antifreeze was located near the bed. Medical examiners did an autopsy and signed off that David had died from ethylene glycol poisoning, and it was ruled as a suicide, but detectives continued to investigate the suspicious death. An examination of the home revealed some interesting things. First, the glass containing the antifreeze had 3 fingerprints, all belonging to Stacy. Second, they found a turkey baster in the garbage can. On the turkey baster, they found trace amounts of David's saliva on the tip as well as antifreeze. Additionally, it had been wiped of any fingerprints once the medical examiners released David's body. Stacy had another quick funeral, and much to the shock of family members from both her first and second husband, she buried David next to Michael. Then, Stacy moved on with her life, utterly oblivious to any investigation going on. David's son was shocked to learn that his father had left everything to Stacy, and was further surprised when Stacy sold his father's company and everything else in his estate. She made off better with the death of her second husband with nearly $200,000. It would take detectives a year to get enough evidence together to establish probable cause, at which point they were able to get approval for the exhumation of Michael Wallace. Detectives felt that if they could find evidence of ethylene glycol poisoning in Mike, it would all but confirm that Stacy had killed both of her husbands. When Michael was exhumed, an autopsy was performed, and it was clear he had not died of a heart attack. Ethylene glycol causes crystals to form in your organs and blood, and it has a telltale sign. And the telltale signs were in both men. Nearly 2 years into the investigation, detectives had enough to hone in on Stacy. Surveillance was approved. First, her cell phone and landlines were tapped and security cameras were put in to watch the house. Detectives hoped to shake up Stacy and get her to say something incriminating. They showed up at her home on September 22, 2007 to question her about the death of David, purposely leaving out that they had exhumed and autopsied her first husband, Michael. Stacy was very caught off guard and confused. She had no idea that she had been investigated and knew immediately what the detectives were angling for with their line of questioning during the questioning. She had said 2 things that stood out. One was that she had mentioned watching a show with David, where a wife killed 2 of her husbands by poisoning them with antifreeze, and that's where she felt like she got the idea from. And the second was when the lead detective asked her to point to which glass she had poured the cranberry juice in for David, and she said, "I poured the cranberry juice." Detectives were shocked that she had more or less admitted to pouring the antifreeze into the cup after she said that. She asked for a lawyer, and the interview stopped. Detectives knew they had successfully shaken her up and hoped that the wiretaps would be the final piece to make an arrest. Meanwhile, they went and interviewed Ashley, Stacy's oldest daughter, who was now at college. Ashley was shocked by detectives' allegations about her mother. She didn't believe them and told them that what they were saying was ridiculous. When detectives left, Ashley immediately called her mother to ask about the detectives, but during the calls, nothing incriminating was said. Officers continued to monitor the phone lines, and just as it was starting to seem like a waste of time, a 911 call was placed from Stacy's home. According to Stacy, she had just found her daughter overdosed on pills. Ambulances rushed over and were able to pump Ashley's stomach and get her stable. They determined that she had overdosed on prescription painkillers, and had it even been a few minutes more, she likely would have died. Ashley said she woke up to her mother by her side, But she was very foggy and couldn't understand what people were saying at first. She floated in and out of consciousness for hours, and when she woke again, there was a detective. The detective informed her that she had attempted suicide, and in her note she had confessed to killing her father and stepfather. Ashley was shocked and told the officers she had no idea what he was talking about. She told detectives that the last thing she remembered was being with her mom. She said that her mom had called her and asked her to come over for drinks. She said that her mom had made her a mixed drink of vodka, orange juice, and Sprite, and she remembered it tasting weird. But Stacy had convinced her it was fine after she drank the drink. She recalled getting very tired and going to bed. She said that she trusted her mom and had no reason to suspect anything sinister. Fortunately for Ashley, detectives had a mounting case against Stacy already, and Ashley was believed. Detectives were sure that Stacy had poisoned Ashley in an attempt to place blame onto her daughter and shift suspicion from her. There was also evidence to support Ashley. The note, for example, had been typed up on a computer and didn't have a written signature. A forensic analysis of the note also determined that it had been written and printed from Stacy's computer. It had gone several revisions, all auto-saved in Microsoft Word, and the timestamps were when Ashley had been in class. Ashley would also have only been 11 at the time of her father's death, and hadn't been home when David had died. Despite Stacy's attempt to divert suspicion, there was no evidence to connect Ashley to either crime, and Stacy now had an attempted murder charge added to her list of crimes. Stacy was arrested at the hospital and was charged with 1 count of second-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. Because Michael had been murdered in a different jurisdiction, she wasn't charged with his murder during her trial. Prosecutors brought David's will in to question. Detectives discovered that Stacy had forged the will that had been used to settle David's estate. Money seemed to be the motive in David's killing. On March 5, 2009, Stacy Castor was found guilty of the murder of her second husband, David, and also guilty for the attempted murder of her daughter, Ashley. She was given the maximum sentence of 25 years for both charges, with the addition of 1 year for the forging of David's will, for a total of 51 years in prison. Neither Ashley nor Bree had anything to do with her mother after she had been arrested. In 2011, David's son sued Stacy for the remainder of his father's estate and won. In 2010, an investigation was also opened into the mysterious death of Stacy's father. Nothing came of the investigation as he'd been cremated, but the detectives noted that Stacy had been named the sole heir in his estate. Though he had been ill for some time before his death, he had been recovering well until he received a visit from his daughter, Stacy. In 2016, Stacy Castor died in prison. She was 48, and according to the prison she had been in, she had died of a heart attack following Stacy's death. The Castor family petitioned to move David's body so that Stacy could not be buried next to David, as per her will had stated. They successfully moved David, and she was instead buried next to her first husband, Michael. In this case, we head to Las Vegas, Nevada in April 2021. This renowned city, always bustling and lively around the clock, offers an abundance of everything. Among the nearly 500,000 residents is 45-year-old Daniel Hulser. Daniel was previously married to Elizabeth Halgilian, a former Republican member of the Nevada Senate, and they shared 3 children, Dana, Jordan, and Sierra. Daniel, a fitness and the outdoors, as well as being creative, earning a bachelor's degree in music and a master's business degree from Corban University in Salem. The family made the move to Nevada when Daniel found work in Las Vegas. And soon after, Elizabeth was elected to the state senate and became the youngest female to be elected to the Nevada legislature as a state senator. 10 years would pass since the couple's wedding in 2001, and the marriage was starting to fall apart. In 2011, Daniel was arrested after Elizabeth alleged that he had tried to force himself on her. Due to Elizabeth's position, the arrest wasn't unknown to the public, and it received a fair amount of media attention. Daniel filed for divorce a month later, amid allegations of Elizabeth having an affair, and he pleaded guilty to misdemeanor counts of coercion and battery and was sentenced to 6 months probation and anger management classes too. After this, almost another decade would go by. Both Daniel and Elizabeth had since remarried. Although Daniel's second marriage would end in divorce as well, he and his second wife would remain close and would continue to use the joint bank account. In 2020, he and Elizabeth would enter into what would become a very contentious and acrimonious battle. With all of this going on in the background, Daniel, as many do, was regularly sharing his life on social media. He showcased a lot of his life to his almost 13,000 Twitter followers, 20,000 Instagram followers, and his many Facebook friends. Sources say that although Daniel was far from perfect, he was working on himself and adored being a father above all else. His family said he was the heart of the Halstead family, and his aunt said his world was all about his children. They were first in his life, always. In June 2020, Daniel's daughter Sierra started dating 18-year-old Aaron Guerrero. They had a fast-moving and intense relationship, and at one point even said they wanted to rob their parents and run away to Los Angeles together. Both sets of parents were immediately disapproving of the relationship anyway, especially after they found out about their runaway plans, and they banned Sierra and Aaron from seeing each other anymore. In the parents' eyes, the young couple's romance had started to fizzle out by December 2020. But Sierra and Aaron were still very much an item and were going to stop at nothing to stay together. They were infuriated at not being able to see each other, and police say this put an unbelievable plot in motion in a bid to remain a couple without interference. In late December 2020, Daniel made a gushing post celebrating Sierra turning 16 years old. After this, several months would go by all accounts with nothing of notes happening. On the April 3rd, Daniel shared another Facebook post of him and Sierra when she younger. 5 days later, everything would change. And in the early morning hours of April 8, 2021, Aaron ran away from his home and went to meet Sierra in secret. Later that day, Daniel's second ex-wife noticed something concerning. $1,300 had suddenly been withdrawn without warning from their joint accounts. With no word from Daniel as to why this would have happened, she sent him a text, but was met with no response. Christine, Daniel's mother, and his ex-wife Elizabeth were also trying to get hold of him. Neither of them were having any luck. Although Daniel had been out of town for several days, he should have been back by now, and there was no reason for him not to be responding. Christine asked a family friend if they could check on her son too, hoping someone else would have more luck than she was. The family friend called Sierra, and Sierra told them that her dad was just in the shower but had broken his phone, which was why he wasn't answering his calls. She promised she would get him to call them back, but that call never came. The same friend followed this up several more times before Sierra started avoiding the calls completely. A panicked Christine sent a message to her granddaughter. Christine wasn't accepting this as an answer and soon contacted Sierra again, this time demanding to know where her father was. Sierra gave the same excuse. He was in the shower. Christine knew something was deeply wrong and threatened to call the police. Sierra subsequently hung up the phone. Shortly after this, surveillance cameras captured Daniel's blue Nissan Altima leaving the area. Christine asked Peggy Newman, Daniel's friend and landlord, if she could visit the house to check in on him. Peggy said she wouldn't be able to get there for a few hours, but she would be happy to make the trip. Scared to enter the house alone, she waited on the driveway for a friend to join her. While this was going on, Christine made the call that every parent dreads. Peggy and her friend discovered the front door was open, Daniel's car was missing, and the house smelled of smoke with a large scorched patch on the living room floor. They tentatively went through every room upstairs but found nothing. Entering the garage, the smell of lighter fluid was strong and thick in the air. On the ground was a sleeping bag, and inside was the badly burned body of Daniel Helser. Police soon pulled up to the home and began to uncover more things that pointed towards a very disturbing series of events. A chainsaw lay on the floor in the living room, and in the kitchen was a saw covered in blood, as well as another handsaw and 2 knives in the sink. They also found receipts from a Home Depot and an ATM. It was quickly noted that an extensive effort to clean up had been made inside the home. The coroner determined that, as well as being burned, Daniel had been stabbed 70 times. 42 of those were in his back. One of the stab wounds cut through a major artery in his neck, and both his lungs had been punctured. He sustained wounds to his shoulders, hands, wrists, and fingers, and at least one wound appeared to have been made through the use of a saw. His body was mutilated before being placed inside the sleeping bag and set on fire. He suffered burns to 40% of his body. His daughter Sierra was missing from the house, as was her boyfriend Aaron, an immediate red flag for the family and police. A quick look into the receipts found in the house led authorities to the all-important CCTV footage. The cameras uncovered Aaron at Home Depot buying saws, gloves, and lighter fluid. And a Winco supermarket camera showed Sierra purchasing 2 gallons of bleach and using Daniel's credit card at an ATM. It didn't take long for officers to put everything together, and a warrant was issued for the pair. On April 13th, officers located the pair, seemingly by chance, almost 400 miles away in another state, Salt Lake City, Utah. They had been stopped when they were asked for proof that they had paid their fare for the train. After running a quick background check, police found that the pair were wanted back in Las Vegas. Authorities soon located Daniel's car, which Sierra and Aaron had stolen and fled in, and a blood-stained blanket was found in the boot. A search of Sierra's phone pulled up a disturbing video that the pair had recorded. They appeared to be lying down in a tent. It is unknown whether this video did actually end up on YouTube or any other platforms, but it still added even more evidence against them. They were extradited to Nevada and booked into the Clark County Detention Center. The teens were faced with 9 felony counts each, which included charges of murder, conspiracy, arson, robbery, and fraudulent use of credit and debit cards. They were held without bail. Chief Deputy District Attorney Christopher Hamner said his office were considering seeking the death penalty in Aaron's case. Although Sierra was charged as an adult as well, Nevada law stipulates she could not face the death penalty because she is under 18, making her automatically exempt. On June 15, 2021, Sierra and Aaron attended an arraignment hearing. They both pleaded not guilty. Family Court Judge Charles Hoskin, who had been involved in the long custody battle between Daniel and Elizabeth, made comments before Daniel was killed and said that he foresaw troubled times ahead. He recalled, "I saw a lot of things with Sierra that caused me concern. It indicates to me that something else is going on with her, and I don't know who at this point is to blame for that, but I'm less concerned about placing blame than I am with regard to this child and the child's relationship with a parent." Daniel's landlord Peggy Newman later said, "I hope he didn't see his daughter hurting him. I know he loved his 3 children very much." The family issued a statement which read in part, "The total lack of remorse on display in the video is both reprehensible and unforgivable. While we are grateful for the work of the detectives and the district attorney, we are waiting for justice to be served with maximum accountability allowed. We love Dan very much and miss him every moment of the day. This is the only statement we will be making." The judge set the trial for Sierra and Aaron for December 2021. Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, is often described by its residents as the quintessential American city, a beautiful, quiet place ideal for raising a family and settling down. The name Fond du Lac, which is French for the bottom or the farthest point of the lake, reflects its location at the southern end of Lake Winnebago. Among the nearly 43,000 people who call Fond du Lac home are Tim, Eve, and Tamika Nance. Eve and Tim had met at a friend's party in 1992 when they were both 16 years old, and their relationship moved fairly quickly. Friends said they both had great senses of humor and were very charismatic, bonding straight away and loving to laugh and entertain people. They soon moved out of their parents' home and into an apartment together. Eve found out she was pregnant a short while, and the pair started planning their wedding. In 1994, when Eve was 9 months pregnant, she was attacked outside of the couple's apartment by a man trying to steal her purse. Tim heard this and ran outside with a gun. In all the commotion, he shot the attacker in the foot. The wound wasn't fatal, and despite Tim and Eve's protests of self-defense, Tim was placed under arrest. As Tim was being taken away by officers, Eve went into labor, and their daughter Tamika was born as Tim was being booked into jail. Tim would remain in jail on assault charges for almost a year, and when he was released in 1995 on the way home, he and Eve stopped at the courthouse and finally got married. Eve was very close to her younger sister Tina, with Tina moving into her sister's home in 1995. 2 years later, Tina gave birth to her daughter, Justice. Justice and Tamika were more like sisters than cousins, and the whole family were a tight unit. In 1997, Tim would be arrested again, this time on a drugs charge, and he served 3 years for this offense. When 2002 came round, Tim, even Tamika, would make the move to Fond du Lac. Although Tim found finding work, Tim was happy to stay at home and look after Tamika, as well as her cousin Justice. Tim was happy to stay at home and look after Tamika, as well as her cousin, Justice. Tamika recalled, "My mom worked a lot. My dad tried and they made the best of it." Tim was a popular man and had a lot of friends in the area, frequently hanging out at local bars and playing pool at the weekends. Time spent away from the home was an issue in the couple's relationship, mainly due to the fact that, according to friends, Tim was well known to be a ladies' man, and this accounted for a lot of his time away. Although Tim had previously tried to cover his tracks, the cheating was becoming more and more blatant, and Eve was well aware of his many affairs. They would row a lot about it, and physical fights would often break out, with Tim even fracturing Eve's leg one night. By 2013, the couple had been married for 15 years, but Tim started up yet another affair. When Eve came home and found the pair in bed, she punched Tim in the face. Everyone was urging the couple to end the marriage, with Eve's brother asking why she was staying with him. Eve said she would rather have some of Tim's time than none of it at all. Tim told a friend he was having his cake and eating it too, and the relationship carried on as it had been. Later that year, on a typical Tuesday in November 2013, the usually quiet police department received a call from Eve Nance. Tim had gone out on Friday evening and not returned home. Eve was both worried and annoyed that he wasn't returning her calls. Many wondered if Tim had disappeared to go and meet another woman, but although all of his friends could attest that it wasn't unusual for Tim to leave home, it was unusual for him to drop out of contact completely, especially for 4 days. The police arrived at the couple's home, and Eve told them she was becoming concerned that something bad had happened to him. She told officers that the last time she had seen him, they had had yet another fight, and Tim had stormed out of the house and gone to Milwaukee, just over an hour away. Eve gave them a theory as to why he could be missing. She explained that one of the ways Tim made his money was by dealing drugs. Over time, Eve claimed the longer he was dealing, the more he was using drugs himself. Although he hadn't been using for a while, she was worried he may have relapsed and accidentally done something to himself or done a drug deal gone wrong and someone had hurt him. Police knew that Tim's record wasn't clean and wondered if drugs was at the root of what had happened to him. But once they started talking to people that also knew Tim, a very different picture was painted. One of Tim's good friends, Tasha, said at one point he dealt a little weed, but he most definitely was not a hardcore drug user. The idea of him disappearing from the family home to go on a drug binge seemed totally unbelievable. Authorities contacted Tim's cell phone provider, and to their concern, there had been no activity for days. It had now been 2 weeks since Eve said she last saw Tim, and the police were having little luck in finding any leads. They could draw no conclusion other than he had been met with foul play. Friends of Tim elaborated more on the fights between the couple and said that Eve had threatened her husband on several occasions, even brandishing a gun at him and the woman he was seeing. But they all acknowledged that Tim was far from perfect himself, and the relationship was on a downward spiral. The more his friends talked, the more everyone became more and more convinced that if something had happened to him, it was something to do with Eve. His friend Tasha said, "I knew right away she killed him." Another more thorough search of the couple's house found a hole in the wall in the bathroom one authorities were sure had come from a bullet. Fond du Lac Police Detective Bill Ledger noticed that the shower curtain liners in the bathroom were brand new and seemed out of place. Eve was asked to come to the station to clarify a few more things. She admitted that although she knew about the many affairs, she denied being bothered by them, saying she accepted who Tim was, and that was just how their relationship worked. She also denied ever threatening Tim and didn't involve herself with his business outside of the family home. But now the police had found a bullet hole and had witnesses that could attest to Eve threatening him on many occasions with a gun. But although they now suspected Tim was dead, officers had yet to find a body, and they didn't have a weapon either, which meant they didn't have enough to arrest Eve for murder. They did, however, have enough to suggest probable cause. Probable cause requires that the police have more than just suspicion, but not to the extent of after a week. Eve asked if she could talk to the investigators, as she now had a very different story to present. She told police that there had been an altercation at the house that night, and when she had tried to walk away by going into the bathroom, Tim had followed her. She said he was the one waving a gun around and started hitting her. The process of her trying to get the gun away from him, the gun went off and Tim was shot twice in the chest, she claimed. The detectives asked why she didn't think to call 911. but Eve said she went blank. And instead of doing this, she took all his clothes off, wrapped him in plastic film from the windows and a shower curtain, put him in the car and drove away. She said she had tossed the gun and empty shell casings out of the window on Highway 41 en route to the woods, where she would ultimately leave Tim's body. Where Tim's phone ended up remains unknown. She gave the police a rough location as to where they could find Tim, and a search quickly got underway. That same evening on Thanksgiving Day, 2013, Tim Nance's body was finally found. He was naked, lying frozen in the snow in the fetal position, almost 50 miles away from his home. An autopsy later revealed that Tim had died as a result of 2 gunshot wounds to the head, not to the chest, and he had been shot sometime on November 1st. Police and prosecutors firmly believe that Tim was actually in the shower at the time he was shot and did not see the attack coming. The medical examiner testified that both shots could not have been fired at close range during the struggle, as Eve had said, and the placement of one of the bullet holes in the wall appeared to confirm this. During their investigation, police also obtained a video of Eve and her sister Tina buying supplies at a store at about 7:30 p.m. on the same day Tim was killed. Tina picked up shower curtain liners and curtain hooks. They argued that the curtain liners were replacements for the ones now covered in Tim's blood. Authorities believe that Tina had helped to conceal the crime. Phone records showed that Eve had called Tina 5 times, just minutes after Tim's death. Officers also argued that Eve wouldn't have been able to move Tim's body without help, and this was where Tina came in. Eve was arrested and charged with murder, and Tina was also placed under arrest. A judge set Eve's bail at $100,000, which was soon increased to $300,000, and $50,000 was set for Tina. In January 2016, 39-year-old Eve Nance stood trial, and she pleaded not guilty. A big part of the prosecution's case was that Eve claimed that Tim was shot in the chest during a fight, but the medical examiner clearly showed that the 2 bullets had entered into Tim's head. The medical examiner also talked about the placement of the bullet hole, which they said showed inconsistencies in Eve's account. And according to the prosecution, the motive was simple: rage and revenge. After years of threatening with him, she had finally done it. They argued that Tim had been taking a shower, hence him being found without clothes on, and Eve had ambushed him and shot him without warning. The prosecution described it as an execution. But according to some experts put forward by the defense, Eve was suffering from battered person syndrome. After years of infidelity in a volatile and violent relationship, this had pushed her to her limits. Although she had reacted in anger, it was also in self-defense, something which friends of Tim strenuously denied. Tim and Eve's daughter, Tamika, however, said that her father was always the aggressor and wanted things his own way all the time. Less than 2 weeks later, the jury had reached a verdict. They sided with the prosecution. Eve was found guilty of first-degree intentional homicide and hiding a corpse. The judge believed that some leniency should be given under the circumstances of everything that had been put forward. When it was her time to speak, "Whatever happens here today, I love you very much. Several people, whatever happens here today, I love you very much." Several people spoke on Eve Nance's behalf, including Tamika, who said, "My mother is not a monster. She is a wonderful person. I miss my father. I can't lose her too." Eve told the judge that she had loved her husband since the first time she saw him, and she still loved him. She said she had no excuse for what she did. No one except the district attorney Eric Toney spoke on behalf of Tim. He said Tim was everyone's best friend and had turned his life around. In Tina Ewell's case, she was found guilty of hiding a corpse as party to the crime, aiding a felon, and obstructing an officer. Fond du Lac County Circuit Judge Peter Grimm ordered Tina spend 24 months in prison with the condition of probation for 5 years. If the conditions of probation were not met, Tina would have to spend another 4 years in state prison and then have 5 years extended supervision. Eve and Tina both filed appeals against their decisions, but both appeals were denied. What happened on that day back in November 2013 can never be known for sure, but what is known is that a young girl essentially lost both of her parents in a terrible way. What actually happened, how it came to be, and the events leading to Tim dying in the bathroom that night remain unconfirmed. Stories of the couple's relationship is contradicted by friends and family of both Tim and Eve. But many of Tim's friends said they didn't want to see Eve get life in prison because they knew Tim wouldn't have wanted it, and said that had he survived the shooting, he would likely have forgiven her. Eve Nance will be in her 60s when she becomes eligible for parole. 16-year-old Shelly and Bexu lived with her parents, Muriel and Sandy, and her older brother, Tim, in Hinton, Alberta. Despite her petite stature, standing barely 5 feet tall and weighing less than 100 pounds, Shelly's physical size did not reflect her vibrant personality. She adored children and aspired to become a teacher. A Christmas enthusiast, she had the ability to brighten anyone's day, no matter how tough their circumstances were. Always eager to help others, she treated everyone equally, disregarding their financial status or social standing. She assumed that everyone shared her giving nature and concern for others, and her mother, Muriel, fears that this trust may have played a role in her sudden disappearance, which occurred on May 3, 1983. That evening, Shelly had been at her boyfriend's home in what is now known as the Hillcrest Trailer Park, but at time was called the Sunset Trailer Court. She called home around 8 p.m. to tell her mother that a friend was coming to give her a ride home and she would be there soon. Shelly asked her mother if she could make her a specific Hungarian noodle dish that was one of her favorite foods. At 9 p.m., Muriel received another phone call, this time from Shelly's boyfriend, who asked to speak with Shelly, and Muriel told him to stop joking around since Shay had not yet returned from his home, before realizing that the fact that he was calling assuming her daughter had already returned home meant that Shelly had left and that something had gone seriously wrong during her travels. Shelly's boyfriend did not have any way of driving her home, so a friend was supposed to come over to give her a ride, like Shelly had said during her earlier phone call. However, that friend was unable to give her the ride as planned, so Shelly had decided to walk the 4 miles between the trailer park on Highway 16 and her home off of Highway 40. Sandy and Tim got in their car to go out looking for Shelly, and Muriel set out on foot to search for her daughter. It was dark and her efforts were hampered by unusually strong winds that whipped through the area that night. Fading through the wind, Muriel walked along the highway, calling Shelly's name, hoping her voice would carry over the howling winds. The authorities were called, and an investigation began. A witness came forward reporting a sighting of Shelly, and they had seen her walking west on the north side of Highway 16 going towards her house. The witness said Shelly did not appear to be trying to hitchhike. Authorities, along with Shelly's friends, family, and neighbors, spent weeks searching for her. The area off of the highway was dense woodland, making the search difficult. A few days into the search, several items that belonged to Shelly were discovered off of the highway near the Athabasca River, approximately 3 miles away from her home. These items included the jacket she had last been seen wearing, a bra, pantyhose, Shelly's library card, and a library book she had taken out on the day she disappeared. Shelly herself, however, remained missing. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police interviewed several persons of interest, but no arrests were made in the case. Authorities remained in contact with Shelly's family for the first decade following her disappearance. But according to her mother, Muriel, while the family continued their own efforts to find Shelly, they did not hear from the RCMP for a period of approximately 15 years, once the 10-year anniversary of Shelly going missing passed. In 2010, Shelly's case was authorities to see if it could be connected to the Highway of Tears series of disappearances and murders in neighboring British Columbia. Ultimately, they decided Shelly's case was unrelated. The RCMP another public appeal about the case in 2013 on the 30th anniversary of Shelly's disappearance. That same year, Shelly's older brother, Tim, passed away from cancer. Shelly's case is currently assigned to the Historical Homicide Unit of the RCMP. They re-interviewed witnesses, investigated new tips, and re-examined evidence using modern forensic techniques. This testing did locate DNA evidence, and the RCMP considers whoever left behind this DNA as a person of interest in the case. However, they have not yet been able to identify the contributor of the DNA. We never close cases, no matter how old, Sergeant Jason Zaslak of Homicide Unit said in 2020. This case is one that really touches the heart. We haven't given up, Given the passage of time and the lack of any sign of Shelly and living elsewhere, both the RCMP and Shelly and's family believe that she most likely is no longer alive. While the RCMP remains focused on the criminal investigation, Shelly and's family just wants to find her. "I'm not looking for justice. I don't think I'll get it," Shelly and's mother, Muriel, said in 2020. "I just want to find my daughter's remains so I can lay her to rest and give her peace. And for us, there is no such thing as closure, but there is peace. All we want is peace." Stephen Neing was born on April 15, 1958 in the seaside town of Blackpool. He was the oldest of 4 children. Remembering her son in 2013, his mother, Jean, said, "I think of his cheeky little freckled face and the way he always used to get up to mischief, whether it was falling off his bike, falling out of a tree, or having his teeth knocked out by a foot in 1969. The family was living on Lee Warner Avenue in Fakenham, Norfolk. That September 2nd was during Stephen's school holidays, so the 11-year-old had been playing with a friend. He told his mother he would be having dinner at his friend's house, and Jean told him to be home by 8 p.m. before he left. When 9 p.m. came that evening and Stephen had not yet returned home, Jean called the police. Stephen was seen by his brother and a friend as he left home around 3 p.m., and another friend believed they saw him walking alone along a road later that evening. He had left his bicycle at home that day and had no money with him. Police conducted door-to-door searches and numerous interviews. Stephen's satchel was found near a water tower not far from his home. Reports of sightings of Stephen came in from Norfolk and Suffolk, and a potential sighting of him, police described as significant, came in from Sutton Bridge in Lincolnshire. There were fears that Stephen may have fallen down a well, but authorities say that possibility has been thoroughly investigated. The Neing family home was searched twice, and authorities are confident that Stephen's family did not play a role in his disappearance. Investigators have considered the possibility that Stephen was abducted, even interviewing a man working at a circus that was in the area at the time of Stephen's appearance. They were concerned may have been involved, but so far they do not have any evidence supporting this or any theory. Stephen's devastated family found various ways to both live with Stephen's loss and honor his life in the years following his disappearance. While they could not have a funeral in the traditional sense as they did not have Stephen's body, they held a memorial service for Stephen at Fakenham Parish Church in 2002, during which a memorial was dedicated to Stephen in hopes that coming together to honor Stephen's life would assist them in their ongoing attempts to cope with his disappearance. Stephen's mother, Jean, worked with the Benjamin Foundation to open the Stephen Neing House in partnership with Flagship Housing and the North Norfolk District Council. The house provides housing and support to vulnerable 16 to 25-year-olds in order to combat youth homelessness. According to staff, Mrs. Neing seemed to take comfort in visiting the residents of the house, and she bought them Christmas presents every year. While Mrs. Neing found ways to honor Stephen's life, she never gave up on her goal of finding her son. "I still very much want to know what happened to him. At my age, I don't know that I'll ever know the truth, but I feel it's important for me to find out," Mrs. Neing said in 2013. She passed away on September 1, 2014, the day before the 45th anniversary of Stephen's disappearance. In 2019, investigators highlighted a little-known detail of the case in hopes that it would jog the memory of witnesses who may have seen Stephen the day he disappeared. The day before he vanished, Stephen had found a white mouse in his neighbor's garden and had been showing it to his friends on the day he went missing. People may not remember seeing an 11-year-old 50 years ago, but they might remember an 11-year-old boy with a white mouse. Norfolk and Suffolk Gold Case manager Andy Guy pointed out, "While the detail is small, Mr. Guy felt he needed to release it. While it was possible that potential witnesses were still alive and able to remember 1969. 50 years on is probably the last time we can appeal to people," he said. "It's the last roll of the dice from the perspective of people's memories. The more than 50 years that have passed since Stephen went missing have not erased the love his brother and 2 sisters have for him or their hope to find their brother. I was the last person to see him, and there is not a day that goes by that I do not think of him and try to work out what happened," Stephen's brother, Terry, said in 2019. "The effects of this have been profound on all our family. Our parents have since died without knowing what happened, and Stephen has an extended family who never met him, only knowing of him from newspaper cuttings and hearsay. However, I still believe that even with the passage of time, the answers we need are still there and would urge anyone with any knowledge of his disappearance, no matter how trivial or insignificant, to please contact the police so that we can do something our parents were unable to do. Lay him to rest and get the closure we need. In 2020, Melinda Lynxleg was a 40-year-old mother of 6 children ranging in age from 4 to 22. She was from Tutankamunzi First Nation in western Manitoba, where the last sighting of her occurred on March 31, 2020. She was seen walking along a gravel road on the outskirts of the community. Melinda had been visiting friends outside of the community. At the time, the community had a blockade set up due to COVID-19, and residents had to check in and out with security as they came and went. Melinda was last seen walking in the direction of the blockade, but she never reached it as she was never logged in there. A purse, confirmed to be Melinda's by her oldest daughter, would later be found on the ground near where she was last seen. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police Detachment in Roblin was notified of Melinda's disappearance on April 16th after her loved ones could not contact her. There has not been any activity on Melinda's bank accounts or social media or contact with any of her family members. By November of 2020, the RCMP had spoken with more than 50 people and followed up on numerous tips in connection to their investigation into Melinda's case. Potential sightings of Melinda throughout Manitoba have been reported since she vanished. However, subsequent review of surveillance footage has found that the woman witnesses believed to be Melinda was not in fact her. While the RCMP has been investigating the case, the physical searching for Melinda has largely been carried out by her large extended family. Their efforts have been limited by their lack of access to resources like equipment and trained personnel and, eventually, for several months, by severe winter weather. Melinda's family is heartbroken over her disappearance, especially her children. It's painful, Melinda's Aunt Betty Lynxleg told CBC News in January of 2021. For the whole family and the siblings, I guess when you lose somebody like that and you just don't know what happened, it's not only shocking, but it's just a daily hurt. Melinda's younger children are in the care of their grandparents. Melinda's family is offering a $5,000 reward for information in the case. In 2020, 45-year-old Fauna Fry was temporarily sharing a home with her father John and older brother Dallas. The three of them worked together in the family business, building and selling homes. The family was close not only because they spent so much time working together, but also because they had survived a great deal of tragedy. Fauna's mother and sister had died within 2 years of each other, with her sister passing away in 2006. Fauna would lose her one remaining sibling in 2020. On June 19th, Dallas Fry unexpectedly died of a heart attack at the age of 47. It was Fauna who found his body after he failed to show up to a home where the family had been working, refinishing its hardwood floors. The death of her brother was a devastating loss for Fauna. On June 27th, she left home in her blue 2000 Jeep Grand Cherokee to drive to Grants Pass, Oregon to give some of Dallas' possessions to a longtime friend of his. That friend did confirm that Fauna reached his home and had delivered the items. On June 28th, Fauna called her father from the Super 8 motel in Grants Pass. She had rented a room for a night there and called from the room's landline. Fauna had left her cell phone, which she typically did not like to use, and her laptop at home when she left on her trip. According to John, Fauna sounded highly distressed, still struggling with the grief caused by the death of her brother. She told him that she had given a ride to a hitchhiker, which was unusual for her. John told Fauna that she should consider looking for a cabin to rent nearby because she would be more comfortable there than she would be in a motel. Fauna did then make a reservation at the nearby We Ask You Inn for the following night and told her father that she would call him the next day after she checked in there. She never did. Fauna had told her father over the phone she was going to take a shower and then run out to the store. According to the friend of her brother's she had gone to see, there had not been any bags or suitcases in Fauna's car when he happened to glance inside of it while she was at his home. Credit card records show that she made purchases at 2 stores in Grants Pass that night. At Big 5 Sporting Goods, Fauna purchased 3 flashlights, only in turn a sports bra, capris, and a pair of tennis shoes. She then went to a Fred Meyer grocery store where she bought shampoo, conditioner, 2 Burt's Bees products, socks, more pieces of activewear clothing, potato chips, a sandwich, and 2 cans of beer. Security footage at the Fred Meyer shows her leaving the store wearing a neon green and purple pullover. Security footage at the Super 8 confirmed that Fauna made it back to her room after she left the store and shows her leaving the motel the following morning, June 29th, with her belongings. This would be the last confirmed sighting of Fauna. She never checked in for her reservation at the We Ask You Inn. Her credit card was still charged for the stay as she never called to cancel a reservation. There has been no further activity on her credit card or bank account. When Fauna did not return home or make any further phone calls to him, her father reported her missing. John has been desperate to find his one surviving child and dedicated himself to the search for her even while he is still in mourning the recent loss of his son. He began driving all over the state searching for Fauna and following up on any lead he can get, sleeping in the back of his truck during his travels. "I've searched half the state of Oregon," he told Dateline in early September, more than 2 months after Fauna went missing. "We're at a standstill and don't know where to go from here. We just want her home safe." John has also hired a private investigator to work on the case. There have been several potential sightings of Fauna reported since her disappearance, but none of them have been confirmed or helped bring Fauna home. Other women close in age and appearance to Fauna went missing in the area around the time of her disappearance, which Fauna's father believes may be part of a pattern. These other disappearances also make it difficult. Be-up prior to going missing was found and interviewed, but could not provide any information about Fauna's whereabouts. Fauna had previously lived in southern Oregon for many years and was familiar with the area. She regularly hiked and was accustomed to the outdoors. On September 23rd, police found Fauna's Jeep north of Galize, Oregon on Rubin Mountain Road, a few miles past the Grave Creek boat landing. The vehicle was locked and authorities believe it had been left where it was found for at least a month. Cadaver dogs were brought in to search the area but did not find anything. The Oregon State Police processed the vehicle for evidence and found some of Fauna's belongings. They found fingerprints which were not yet processed as of February of 2021. As there is not yet definitive evidence of a crime being committed, the fingerprints have not been prioritized over other evidence needing to be processed at the lab. On the first anniversary of Fauna's disappearance, a rally was held outside of the Josephine County Courthouse to bring attention both to Fauna's case and to other similar cases in the area. Fauna's family was supported at the rally by others concerned by the large number of women who have gone missing in southern Oregon in recent years, including activists from the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women movement and the families of other missing women, including relatives of 43-year-old Lisa Cronin, who disappeared from Sunny Valley, Oregon in December of 2019. There is currently a $100,000 reward being offered in Fauna's case. Fauna remains missing, and her father remains committed to finding her. 6-year-old AJ Daer lived in Immokalee, Florida, and was a student at Village Oaks Elementary School. He lived with his mother, Marie Nieta, and his stepfather, Antal Allant. Marie came to the United States from Haiti in 2001. She returned to Haiti for a 3-month visit, during which time she conceived AJ, who was born after she came back to Florida. AJ's biological father, Yves Daer, remained in Haiti, and Antal considered AJ to be like his own son. AJ loved spending time at his grandmother's house in the Immokalee Farm Workers Village and playing with children from the neighborhood. He spent a lot of time there, especially when his parents were at work. His mother worked in nursing at an assisted living facility in North Naples, and his stepfather worked at a local pizza parlor. AJ was at his grandmother's house on Saturday, January 10, 2009. He spent most of the day coming in and out of the house, and ate lunch with his grandmother. When he was outside, his grandmother kept an eye on him through the window as he played. AJ's stepfather came to pick him up around 5 p.m., but could not find AJ amongst the group of neighborhood children playing outside. He asked the other children where AJ was, but none of them knew where he had gone. AJ's grandmother had last seen him from inside the house approximately 15 minutes earlier. Neighbors helped look for AJ in the neighborhood and in nearby woods, but could not find him, so the authorities were called. The search effort for AJ and the investigation into his disappearance was headed by the Collier County Sheriff's Office. Canine units were brought in and searchers combed the area on foot, on horseback, and on altering vehicles. In addition to the Collier County Sheriff's Office, law enforcement agencies from neighboring and the federal government also joined in the search for AJ. These agencies included the Lee County Sheriff's Office, the Henry County Sheriff's Office, the Charlotte County Sheriff's Office, the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the Henry Correctional Institution, which provided bloodhounds to the search effort. AJ's neighbors helped look for him as soon as his disappearance was noticed, and volunteers from the larger community quickly volunteered to join in the effort. Within just the first 6 days of the search for AJ, authorities estimated that between law enforcement professionals and volunteers, nearly 1,000 people helped look for him. Despite this massive effort, no sign of AJ was found. AJ's parents described him as a good boy who knew to stay close to his grandmother's house when he was outside. He had never run away or wandered off in the past. AJ was developmentally delayed, and while he was 6 years old, he was estimated to have the mental capacity of a 2-year-old. AJ was largely nonverbal, mainly communicating by shaking his head or nodding. While he would not verbally respond to people who talked to him, he did understand very well when he was spoken to. However, he mainly understood Haitian Creole, and his English vocabulary was more limited. Because of his special needs, there were also concerns that AJ may be alarmed by the noise created by the search parties and hide from them out of fear. His parents believed that he would be able to comprehend that he was lost and needed help, but would most likely be too afraid to approach a stranger to try to get assistance. Over 100 tips were called in within the first week following AJ's disappearance, and authorities cleared more than 80 of them within that same time period. They believed AJ most likely either wandered off or was abducted, but they have no strong evidence supporting either scenario. According to the other children who had been outside at the time, they did not see any suspicious vehicles or individuals. AJ's case received national attention and was featured on America's Most Wanted 3 times in 2009, and he was one of 6 missing children featured on the cover of People magazine that November. Thanks to a partnership between the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the United States Postal Service, and Valaces, one of the nation's largest marketing companies. AJ's picture and information were included with national direct mailing advertising flyers distributed in November and December of 2009. The flyers reached 75 million homes across the United States. For months after AJ's disappearance, his mother gave birth to a daughter, named Ajayani in honor of her missing brother. AJ's family has said they will never give up on finding him. "We still have never forgotten, never in my life," his mother said in 2019. Even a decade after he went missing, they still had not been able to give up hope on the possibility of finding him alive, and their hopes were raised when another missing child, Jamie Kloss, was found alive in Wisconsin. "I think he's still alive because I don't want to think something can happen." Antoine Lallant said in 2019, "I want to think he's still there." Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.